Welcome to Standard 11C. In this standard, we will examine the events related to the rise, the aggression, and the human costs of the dictatorial regimes that developed in the years after World War I in the Soviet Union, in Germany, in Italy, and in Japan. In order to do this, we have two essential questions. The first is, why did dictatorships, dictatorial governments emerge in these four countries in the years after World War I? Why not some other form of government like democracy? Why dictatorships? Secondly, how did these regimes affect the world following World War I? Okay, some essential understanding. We have a couple of pieces here in order to work through this standard. The first is understanding that the worldwide depression that we saw in Standard 11B throughout the 1930s really provided the opportunity for these dictators to take power and strengthen their power in these four countries. The famous picture here of the children in Germany playing with blocks of money as if they were toy blocks gives a sense of how worthless the German currency, the German money, was at this time. In such an environment, dictatorships are easy to get established and to increase their power. We see here the unemployment rate in Germany. And this would have been true in a number of countries. We can see the very rapid rise from roughly 2 million people in 1928 to 6 million people just a few years later in 1932. Those unemployed people, that increase in unemployed people was a large number of people willing to look to a leader like Hitler for easy answers, easy solutions. I always thought this understanding was a little bit of a stretch. It does explain a lot, but keep in mind the dictatorships in Italy and the Soviet Union were established even earlier, during the 1920s, before the Great Depression hit. It is fair to say, though, that the Great Depression allowed those dictatorships to increase their power even more. Okay, second piece of essential understanding. In the Soviet Union, the communist dictatorship that we saw established in Standard 10C by Vladimir Lenin was continued and strengthened by his successor, Joseph Stalin. We see here in this photograph, this is Lenin in the middle. Lenin dies in 1924 after a series of strokes that left him unable to speak or communicate, so it wasn't really clear who Lenin wanted to succeed him. We see Stalin on the left and another one of his rivals, a guy named Trotsky, on the right. When Lenin died, it wasn't really clear who would take over. Trotsky, so terrified of Stalin, actually packs up him and his family and they move to Mexico to get out of the way of Stalin. But even that wasn't enough for Stalin. Stalin still sends his secret police to Mexico and they killed Trotsky with an ice pick in the back of the head. Very ruthless but effective way to send a message to his potential rivals that Stalin was now in control. Another piece of essential understanding is to understand the connection between the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I in creating the economic and political conditions, in particular in Germany and Italy, that are going to lead to the dictatorships there of, as we see in the photograph, Mussolini on the left and Hitler on the right. There's really a direct connection in those two countries from the Treaty of Versailles and the treatment of these two countries by the Treaty of Versailles and the rise of dictatorships in these countries. Okay, and then for our final piece of essential understanding, we go to Asia, where we take a look at Japan, which after World War I began to emerge, began to develop as an industrial power, and its quest for natural resources, much the same as the Europeans in the 1800s, led it to follow a path of very aggressive imperialistic policies. In other words, Japan was on a quest for colonies in Asia, and that helped to fuel the rise of a dictatorship in Japan. Okay, we see here on our map the Japanese expansion in the early part of the 1900s, from its island country here of Japan into Korea, into Manchuria, the northeastern part of China, and other parts of Southeast Asia. Okay, so the meat of the standard that we need to know here, we need to know some information about 4 of these dictators, one in each of these countries that we mentioned. Okay, so we'll start here with Joseph Stalin, who was the dictator, the communist dictator of the Soviet Union. From the time that Lenin dies, there's a brief power struggle in which Stalin gets rid of some of his opponents, but from roughly 1924 until Stalin's death in 1953. A couple of things we need to know and associate with Stalin. Stalin is noted for the creation of 5-year plans. These were state-made, government-made policies for the next 5 years that dictated how much of different products and services were going to be provided. Stalin's 5-year plans really focused on state industrialization, meaning he wanted Russia to become an industrial power very quickly. We can see in this chart here that in general, Stalin succeeded in that industrial goal of increasing Russia's industrial production. We see, for example, coal and steel and oil and electricity all going up during his time as ruler. Unfortunately, Stalin's plans kind of underestimated agricultural production. Not enough food was produced during this time. There was actually quite a bit of starvation, and millions of people die of hunger in Russia during this time. In part because of that starvation and an effort to reverse it, Stalin rolls back what Lenin had done in his new economic plan. If we remember in Standard 10C, we said that Lenin's new economic plan allowed some small-scale private ownership. Farmers were allowed to own small pieces of land, keep the excess production that they made, instead of the communist government owning everything. Stalin's going to undo all of that. He's going to collectivize the land, which means that all the little farms were going to be gathered into big state-owned farms instead of individual farmers farming their land. Hundreds of farmers together would be working these big pieces of land, like we see in this picture here. Stalin creates a system of secret police. Okay, basically people who spied and informed on people who were speaking out or plotting against the government, and a system of gulags, which were prison camps, where if you weren't killed by Stalin, you and your family might be sent to do forced labor for a period of time. Okay, so the secret police and gulags we associate with Joseph Stalin. The Great Purge in the 1930s was Stalin's effort to get rid of those who weren't loyal to him or not supportive of the communist government in the Soviet Union. You basically disappeared. Millions of people during this time were killed really for their political beliefs or their opposition to the government. Long before Photoshop, we see the pictures. This is how paranoid Stalin really is. We see in this picture here Stalin walking with a member of the government who later on had a falling out with Stalin. So notice the guy on the right in the picture. Notice the picture below. This is the same picture where the guy has essentially been airbrushed out of the picture as if he never existed. Okay, and this is what happened during the Great Purge. Okay, as a result of Stalin's policies, communism is firmly entrenched. Okay, meaning it was firmly put in place in the Soviet Union. There really was no questioning communism as a result of Stalin's rule. Okay, we'll move on to Adolf Hitler in Germany. Rules a little bit shorter period than Stalin, 1933, when he comes to power, until his death at the end of World War II in 1945. Hitler, noted for anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish feelings and beliefs. As ruler, we see that expressed in things like the Star of David that Jews had to wear on their clothing out in public to identify them as Jewish. In 1938, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, when Hitler's Nazis go through the cities, basically breaking the windows in Jewish businesses, burning down Jewish synagogues. That's all evidence of Hitler's anti-Semitism. Hitler just practiced a very extreme form of nationalism. He saw the Germans as the ideal race, and that helps to develop his political philosophy, National Socialism, which most people refer to as Nazism, this sort of cult of personality that develops around Hitler. Even before World War II breaks out, Hitler's already invading and taking over neighboring lands. Hitler occupies with the German army Austria in 1938, and neighboring Czechoslovakia, a largely German area known as the Sudetenland, in 1939. Okay, and the taking over of these lands is really a precursor for Hitler's expansion in World War II. Okay, we move on to Italy and the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, who rules from 1922 until his death at the end of World War I in 1945. We want to associate the word fascism with Mussolini. Mussolini has this ambition to bring back the glory of Rome. He saw himself really as a second Julius Caesar, that he was going to restore the Roman Empire. In fact, here we see Mussolini on horseback in front of the Colosseum. The word fascism, his political party, the Fascist Party, actually comes from a Latin word fasci, which was a Roman symbol of power. It was an axe with a bundle of sticks tied around it, the sticks making a little more weight and carrying a little more power to the axe. Part of Mussolini's plan to expand Italy's control over what the areas that once were in Rome's control includes North Africa, where Italy did have colonies in Libya, and other areas of North Africa. But in 1935, Mussolini invades Ethiopia, which, if you remember from the age of imperialism, was one of only 2 African countries not colonized by Europeans during the Industrial Revolution. So the takeover of Ethiopia in 1935 is another thing we want to associate with Mussolini. Okay, and finally here, Japan, we want to know the name Hideki Tojo. And Hideki Tojo we associate with the term militarism. Japanese militarism really develops during this time in between World War I and World War II. A lot of it had to do, militarism, kind of even education in Japan became very military-based, training young kids to be soldiers. Japan was very rapidly industrializing during this time, and Japan doesn't really have a lot of natural resources on its own. So that caused Japan to really look to its neighbors in Asia, places like Korea, the area known as Manchuria in northeastern China, and eventually much of southeastern Asia as a source of natural resources. Tojo, who was a general for most of his career, he becomes the prime minister of Japan, so he's both a military leader and a political leader by the time of World War II. Okay, so these are the 4 leaders that we want to know who are associated with this period of dictatorship between World War I and World War II.